The 16th season of the television series aired on the mainland and in Australia in February, although the mainland was 2 days behind Australia, as the latter was the first country in the world to show it. The engines and Sir Richard and Stephen, however, didn't like the season, since it was another lot of fabricated stories. But they were at least grateful that a new production team was coming in to take over and improve the television series. However, they were sad that Nitrogen Studios were to stop animating the series. Meanwhile in Japan, the television series had moved to a new broadcaster, NHK, also called Japan Broadcasting Corporation. This was made as a multi-year deal made by Hit Entertainment. The television series, as well as the All Engines Go series, are still on the air after the deal was made over 10 years ago. Sadly, Alan Pegler, the first private owner of Scott and the saviour of the Festiniog Railway, had passed away at the age of 91. In the spring on Sodor, Sir Richard Topham Hatt had sent Gordon to the North Yorkshire Moors Railway to attend their spring gala, and he let Boko take his express and local trains for him. It had been a while since Boko had taken a passenger train, and now he was to pull it while Gordon was away. Boko ran the trains well, and the passengers enjoyed his smooth ride, as well as taking his photograph and video due to his popularity with the express. Later, Gordon had returned from the NYMR on the mainland, and lots of photographers were waiting for him to pass. One stood close to the line and Boko had warned him. Luckily, the person responded, and he nearly collided with him. Luckily, no one was hurt, but Boko and the man were shocked by the near miss. Boko was quiet for the rest of the day and had an uneasy sleep that night. However, Sir Stephen told Boko that it wasn't his fault, and that the man was breaking railway regulations. Although we said that the man hadn't been charged, it turned out that he did, and of course had to pay a hefty fine for standing near a railway line. The man had learned his lesson, and he was never seen or heard from again. Later in the summer, news came out that Queen Elizabeth II would be visiting the island of Sodor in honour of her Diamond Jubilee. This would be her first visit since her Golden Jubilee. Daisy had always admired the Queen and would love to take her to the big station, but Sir Richard had given the job to Gordon, which made her feel very sad. On the day of her visit, the engines were all busy taking passengers to the big station to see the Queen. Daisy had told Toby at the junction about wanting to take the Queen herself, but Toby had said that she may have that chance one day, since there would be many events that the Queen might attend. Meanwhile, Gordon was racing down the line with the royal train, but as he neared the station, he broke down. Steam had leaked somewhere in his boiler, and he can't make any more. Everyone was waiting at the big station, and when the news broke, Daisy offered to help Gordon. When she arrived, she was coupled to Gordon, and then the Queen had asked if she could ride in her. At first, Daisy was hesitant, but after asking Gordon, and with Gordon being fine with it after what Toby had told him, Daisy agreed. She was given a big greeting by the passengers and engines when she rolled in. At last, she fulfills her dream of taking the Queen. With the Diamond Jubilee being all the hype, there was other excitement too. 7 years after its announcement in 2005, the Olympic Games had finally come to London, and the Olympic torch was to tour around the mainland, Northern Ireland and the British Isles, including the Isle of Man and the island of Sodor. Not many people were in favour of the Olympic Games due to their massive expense and how the buildings used for the Games ended up being wasted away, as shown in other countries that had once hosted the Olympics there. Some of the engines agree as well, but when they saw the excitement on people's faces whenever the torch passes, they knew that despite flaws with the IOC, the Olympics do bring sporting spirit and unity to everyone. Meanwhile, the DVD special Blue Mountain Mystery was released in cinemas in Australia in July, the United States in August, and then on the mainland in Sodor in September. After viewing it, the engines enjoyed it. The events of the special were entirely fictional, as Luke came to the island of Sodor during the 1970s, while Victor came in the 1920s. So the story of Luke knocking over Victor off the ship was made up for the story, as that had never happened. It would be released later in the autumn of that year on DVD. Later, the movie would be released in the United States on home video, and then in Australia. On Sodor, Henry was thinking about what his life had been like if Sir Topham Hatt had gotten rid of him. It didn't end too well, but it was all just a dream in the end, and he was thankful that he was still here on the island. Later on in the year, the football season was in swing, and one night Napperd United was versing Wellsworth City. However, after a football match, things could get rowdy from some of the fans, as they would bang on the walls of the carriages, sing their team song, and sometimes break windows, which upset the coaches very much. James had to deal with this when he pulled the fans special. At first, James was pleased to do such a job and told Pip and Emma about it. However, Pip told James that fans could get a little rowdy. James scoffed, but he soon learnt it the hard way in the end. Over in Asia, another new live show was made, which was exclusive to the Asian region, called Tomas and the Hidden Treasure. This time, the voices were provided by the voice actors that have provided the voice for the television counterparts of Tomas, Percy, James, Gordon, and Harold, which were Ben Small and Keith Wickham. The songs in the stage production are either made by Michael O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, Robert Hartshorn and Ed Welch, Peter Woodruff and Charlie Grant, including two originals made for the show called Tomas, the One and Only You, and No Confusion, No Delay, as well as What Shall We Do with a Drunken Sailor, a 19th century sea shanty. The show started in Singapore. Later that year, the show made its debut in the Netherlands. With the summer over, track maintenance was to be done. It wasn't a pleasant job, especially when it was raining, and one day, Henry was to help out at his tunnel. After collecting the ballast from Edward, who was helping out on the Little Western, Henry puffed away to the tunnel. One night, Percy teased him about being at the tunnel in the rain, saying that it was the perfect weather for it. Cross with Percy's teasing, Henry then told him to find a nice flooded lake to bathe in, as what happened to him back in 1955. The two engines argued about their past mishaps. Then Edward told them that there were more stories than them in the books, and he told the two engines about a woman named Maggie Smith, not the actor, who was stricken by a train in Henry's tunnel. Henry scoffed, but soon found out in the end that the legend was true. To this day, Maggie Smith still lingers in the tunnel. Later on, Percy was being boastful about his handling of the trucks, and when he was to take some empties from Crosby, James had warned him about them, but Percy, still boastful, didn't heed the warning, and when he took them, the trucks were troublesome and it derailed Percy at the harbour, crashing into the sea. He was soon derailed and Sir Richard came to see him. Percy was worried, but Sir Richard smiled and was proud of Percy to try and stop the trucks, and as a reward, he was to have a new coat of paint and some repairs done. But James had teased him about taking the plunge again. As Christmas approached, the railway would take presents to all the stations for the people who couldn't afford presents at this time of year. We had said it was done with the Salvation Army, but we now know that that was all done by Sir Richard himself from his own pockets from his generosity. Donald and Douglas did something like that back in Scotland and would love to pull the one on Sodor, but Sir Richard had given the job to Henry. Donald and Douglas were sad while taking the Christmas mail, but to them there was always next year. The presents train would often stop at other stations, and other engines would take the presents on their branch lines. But this year was long and heavy, and Henry later broke down for straying too much from it. Donald and Douglas, who was shunting on Edward's branch line, were told to help Henry and to take the presents train for him. So they did, and at last they got to take the train they were yearning for. Then they took Henry to the works. Sir Richard was pleased and called them really useful. The year had started with Toby being pulled by Gordon with the express, although it was done by accident of course, and Gordon was very apologetic about it in the end. Later, Harry, the station master's son at Knapford, was bored and wished he could do something fun during his half-term holiday. He would tease the engines and makes wisecracks to them. The engines don't even like him because of that. George, his father, was to look after him while his mother was away on a business trip, and he whinged and complained about being bored as he was not into trains. One day he saw the guard and thought he would have some fun. Meanwhile, Thomas was to take a charter train using some express coaches. As Bertie rolled into the car park with Thomas's passengers, Thomas then heard the guard's whistle and thought it was for him, but it was too early for him to leave just yet. However, they went on their way, leaving the passengers behind. But just as Thomas neared the open line, James was coming through on his path. They both braked and stopped. Luckily, James wasn't going too fast and thankfully no one was hurt. But it caused confusion and delay, and Harry was to blame. His father then told him that the guard's whistle was not a toy. In the end, Harry soon learnt his lesson about whistles and grew to be nicer to the engines, and the engines began to like him as well. Meanwhile, vandals were causing havoc on the main line, almost causing an accident with Henry and Gordon. Luckily, NWR D2 Bear had managed to stop them, and the criminals were then taken into custody by the police, and Bear was hailed as a hero. After that, Thomas's whistle had become jammed and was blowing it all night. This was after Gordon had demanded him, Percy and Duck earlier to whistle at him for respect. However, Gordon would soon realise that respect is earned, not given. At Elsbridge, Molly, the station master's cat, had gone missing. However, it turned out that she had taken refuge inside Toby's cab, and she had given birth to some kittens. In the United States, a new DVD of the television series was released called Railway Mischief, with brand new stories never before seen. This was the start of a new era, as the stories were written by Andrew Brenner, who had written some stories about the engines of Sodor through the Thomas the Tank Engine comics that were released by Marvel during the 1980s to the early 1990s, and his team over on the mainland based it on the events that had happened during 1980. However, the episodes were exclusive to Walmart, a massive retail chain. Some of these episodes wouldn't be released on the mainland and Sodor until June on television. So Richard had sent James to the harbour on Edward's branch line while Salty was away at the works. James hated shunting and he always thought nothing ever exciting happened in harbours. However, Edward said that there is, and he would just have to wait. And something exciting did indeed happen after a ship, bringing in passengers from the mainland for Boko to take on tour of the island before going for défauché at the big station, had sunk due to a fishing boat colliding with the ship. With news of City of Truro being withdrawn from service on the mainland, Duck and Oliver were sad that a fellow Great Western engine may never steam again, and instead be a museum piece. However, both Oliver and Duck had remained optimistic and hoped that the museum would reconsider. Although as of 2022, City of Truro is still a museum display, but at Steam at Swindon. Meanwhile, Diesel was lurking in the background, and he thought of teasing the engines about their old age. He had teased Oliver and then Edward, whom Oliver helped with the shunting at Wellsworth. However, Diesel was soon stuck on the hill with a goods train, and Oliver soon proved himself that despite being old, he still got it in him. So Stephen scolded Diesel for teasing, and told him that he too was getting old, and that he should act his age. Diesel agreed to that condition, but some engines had high doubts about him. Over on the mainland and Sodor, the first 10 episodes of Series 17 were broadcasted on television. The engines were given a special screening and they thought it was a great improvement. However, they were surprised that only 10 had been released so far. However, they were told that more would be released from September. Meanwhile, another notorious vehicle was causing trouble on the island, and that was of course George the Steamroller. One day he was on display with Trevor at the Jolly Miller pub, which is located near the bridge where Thomas went fishing. Earlier, George had been boasting about it to the engines, saying that road vehicles are far superior to railway engines, even as far as saying that he'd never had an accident unlike them. However, we know, don't we, that George had been in some accidents, and some were caused by him. At the pub, George and Trevor chuffed up and down the road, with George boasting about himself to the branch line engines as they passed. However, an out-of-control lorry had swerved out of George's way, and George did as well to avoid a collision, which resulted in him crashing into the pub. Luckily, the building was strong, but this had led George to be suspended from the road, and his owner, Jem Cole, removed his roller and fired the driver for near-life endangerment to the patrons. George then learned not to gloat anymore, but how long would that last? A few days later, Toby steamed crossly in the shed after a person from a railway museum on the mainland had said he wanted to buy him because he was old and out of date, which had offended Toby, and he blew steam at him. This is where Thomas told Toby about the time he was considered being sold to a Butlins holiday camp in Filey on the mainland. After the story, Toby apologised to the museum owner, and the latter understood Toby's words. James was boasting about his design being flawless, and how he had never made a mistake until Percy mentioned jammed brakes. However, after he was cleaned and polished for his evening train, James's firebox doors were jammed right open. This can be very dangerous, as when going through tunnels, the fire could cause a blowback, so Henry had to take his train for him, and Gordon and the others ended up teasing James for his boasting. However, the same thing happened to Gordon the next day, and Bear ended up taking his stopping train. Both engines learned what comes around goes around. Meanwhile, over on the mainland, Mallard was celebrating his speed record's 75th anniversary with a special display at the National Railway Museum in York with his preserved classmates, including 2 from North America, Dwight D. Eisenhower from Green Bay that we mentioned in our 1970s timeline video, and Dominion of Canada from the Canadian Railway Museum in Quebec, Canada. Spencer too was also invited to take part. The display took place from July 3rd to the 17th, and will later be done again in the autumn. In June, Bittern, another preserved A4 locomotive on the mainland, had achieved a speed record for preserved steam by reaching the speed of 92.8 miles per hour near Arleslie in Bedfordshire. This was done with special permission approved by Network Rail to allow Bittern to go beyond the 75 miles per hour speed limit that many mainline certified steam locomotives had to oblige. With summer, the engines were all seeing the extra work given to them. The hot weather and busy atmosphere made Thomas cross, and he wanted a rest. However, Toby, Percy, and Daisy, who was helping from Harwick, were cross with Thomas's complaining, and Percy told him that he should grow ill and Sir Richard should put him off work. Sarcastically, of course, but it gave Thomas an idea, and he pretended to grow ill, leaving all of the extra work to the others. But when it was found that Thomas had 50's illness, he was sent to the sheds in disgrace, leaving everyone disappointed in him, especially Annie and Clarabelle. Over in Japan, an art exhibition of the illustrations of the Railway series was held, celebrating 40 years of the book's Japanese debut. The exhibition featured illustrations from C. Reginald Dorby to Peter Gunfer and Edwards, and even Clyde Spong, whose illustrations were never seen by the Japanese public before. Alongside the exhibition were the models from the television series that had come from Nitrogen Studios. The exhibition would tour around Japan for 2 years. The models used for the television series would be placed on running display at the Hara Model Railway Museum in Yokohama in 2014, alongside the museum's collection of Gauge 1 models that were once owned by Noburatu Hara. As of 2022, the museum still owns the models. In August, King of the Railway was first released in cinemas in Australia, and then on the mainland in Sodor. However, it had its international debut on Polish television in July. The movie showcased the opening of Olstead Castle as happened back in 1980. However, as mentioned in our 80s timeline video, most of the story was fabricated. The engines were given a special preview of the movie, and while they had opinions on the fabricated stuff, they had certainly enjoyed it, and much better than the stuff from the last 3 years. The heat continued on, and while Percy, Daisy, Annie and Clarabelle couldn't stay cross with Thomas for long, Toby hadn't forgiven him for his lie. Meanwhile, Gordon was stopped by a cow at Henry's tunnel, reminding him of his incident with the cow that was blocking his path on the viaduct. This led to the other engines teasing him, especially Thomas, who was let out of the shed. Gordon had warned Thomas that the same might happen to him, and indeed it did at the tunnel near Mrs. Kindly's cottage. The cow went to the tunnel for some shade. Thomas tried to blow his whistle and whoosh his steam, but the cow was used to the engines and didn't bother. Thanks to Mrs. Kindly, she had rung for help, and Toby came with a farmer. After getting the cow out of the tunnel, Thomas was late and the news spread quickly. Although Gordon found it funny, he told Thomas that they were even. But Thomas had learned that he would feel sorry for any engine that was late instead of teasing them, and when Thomas apologized to Toby about his fib, Toby had forgiven him and was soon friends again. Meanwhile, on the mainland, Bitten was supposed to do 2 more 90 miles per hour runs during July, but because of the heat and further weather issues during the year, the trains were respectively rescheduled to December instead. Autumn came and Doug, who was hauling a goods train, had a leak from his boiler. Earlier, Diesel had teased Duck for being thirsty too much. Duck was placed in a siding at Crosby, and Donald took over his goods train. However, Diesel thought it was really funny and called Duck Drippy. A few days later, Diesel ran out of fuel due to the low capacity of his tank, and he had to stop and was rescued by none other than Duck. After that, Diesel had decided not to tease him about being thirsty again. Meanwhile, King of the Railway was released on DVD on the mainland and Sodor on September 2nd. It was later released in the United States on September 17th, and then in Australia on October 3rd. A few days later, Gordon was waiting for his coaches for his local service, but his coaches weren't at the platform, and he waited and waited in the siding for his coaches. However, the signalman thought Gordon had gone and sent Duck with a goods train onto the same track as Gordon. Luckily, Duck had stopped in time. However, Gordon had demanded Duck to bring him his coaches. That was until Sir Richard told him that they were on platform 3. This was because their timetable and path had been amended due to a section of track being in repair. However, Gordon and his crew had forgotten it, and an embarrassed Gordon puffed away and took his train away. A few weeks later, more episodes from the 17th season had finally aired on television on the mainland and Sodor, and it started with the Lost Puff on September 30th. Later on, James was tasked to take the flying kipper for Henry due to his firebox not burning properly. James hated pulling the kipper due to his incident with some fish back in 1992. As he took the train, a fire broke out in one of the vans. Luckily, the fire service arrived and put out the fire. The flames were caused by a hot box from the wagon. However, the nickname the Flaming Kipper, and with James being associated, have been stuck since. Meanwhile, over in Australia, the 17th season of the television series had aired down under. However, it had started with Gordon Runs Dry instead of Kevin's Cranky Friend, as over on the mainland and Sodor in June. In addition, Australia had even aired all of the episodes of the 17th season with no breaks in between, unlike what had happened on the mainland in Sodor. Over in the United States, American fans were given a Christmas DVD called Santa's Little Engine, featuring 4 episodes from the 17th season, and 1 episode re-narrated by Mark Morahan from the 13th season called Snow Tracks. During the DVD was a segment called Storytime with Mr. Perkins, and it showcased the story of the Flying Kipper that had happened to Henry in 1934, with illustrations that were done by C. Reginald Dalby in the book that was released in 1951, and with some additional artwork in the style of Dalby by Lorraine Marshall. These segments will carry on until 2015. Donald was asked to take some trucks from the Diesel that had engine failure to the docks at Brendan. Donald was determined but was having trouble caused by mainland trucks causing him to be late. Thankfully, the ship was due to leave the next day. To make matters worse, the points leading to Edward's branch line had jammed and the workmen had gone home, and so Donald had to stay at Brendan for the night, leaving the mainland trucks something to laugh at. During the night they had ordered for a story, and Donald told them a story that he thought he had made up about a man named William Campbell, who had played the bagpipes to his lost love who was washed away from the shores. One night he went into the sea, and was never seen again. Some say that on the last day of October, you would hear his bagpipes playing, followed by his last words and then a splash. The trucks thought it was rubbish and were boasting about their bravery. Donald had decided to put the trucks' bravery to the test by having his driver play the bagpipes. Meanwhile, Sir Richard had told Donald that he was to take the trucks from the mainland to Barren Furnace. That night the trucks heard bagpipes, some words, and a splash. The trucks thought it was William Campbell and ended up being scared. Donald arrived late due to a derailed coach, but the trucks were at a loss for words after what they had witnessed. However, they soon told Donald what had happened, which made Donald proud at the end, or so he thought. Sadly, in November, everyone was sad to hear the passing of Wilbert Audrey's youngest daughter, Hilary Fortnum, who had passed away after years of battling cancer. Her funeral was held on December 2nd, with 300 people paying their respects to her, including Sir Stephen and Richard Topham Hatt, both of whom were representing the railway and Sodor. A few days later, a big windstorm had swept across the island and had blown a tree blocking the line. However, it reminded Thomas of the time of his first Christmas. As Christmas loomed near, Diesel was in the shed after completing his jobs in the morning, and he soon grew bored and told his driver, who did some Christmas shopping, that James had broken down, and that they must go and help him. However, once again, Diesel had lied, but got his own back when his cooling system had frozen up. However, James arrived with some coal, and after Diesel's driver explained about James breaking down, James was cross, but thought Diesel breaking down had served him right, and he placed him into a siding, and his driver rode in James's train as he went to the next station to call for help. Diesel was left in the siding all day. The works had promised to collect him, but was so busy with other work that they had forgotten him. At the Christmas party, James was telling Edward that he was glad Diesel was left in the siding, but Edward then told him that it was Christmas, and regardless of Diesel, it's still wrong to leave him somewhere abandoned. So Edward collected him, and Diesel was having fun. Sir Richard then told Diesel and James about lies and laughing at other misfortunes, but they were indeed sorry. Sir Richard, however, was still worried about Diesel's behavioural problem. Every year at Christmas, the North Western Railway delivers toys to the children's ward, donated by the 4 Sir Tophams every year. Henry was supposed to take the toys but had a jammed piston, and Thomas was instead chosen to take them, to the approval of Sir Richard. Along the way, a low tree branch had landed on Thomas's running board, damaging his lamps. Luckily, the guard had given Thomas a spare one, although the light was rather dim. At the junction, Thomas stopped to collect water, and just then a lorry driver stopped nearby on his brake. He saw Thomas and his crew feeling down with the lighting, but the lorry driver allowed him to use some Christmas lights they had taken down for the year from the town of Elsbridge, and the lights shone the way for Thomas as he reached Wellsworth with his train. The head of the hospital was very pleased, and a couple of days after Christmas, Thomas and his crew were given a present, which was a tea cozy shaped like Thomas. Coincidentally, a book was published back in 1995 in the United States called The Midnight Rider Thomas the Tank Engine, which had events almost similar to what had happened in 2013. Life imitates art. With Christmas over, the new year was about to come. Every year, a New Year's party is held at the big station, and the nearby church rings its bell every year at midnight to welcome the new year. Donald and Douglas were feeling a little homesick. In Scotland, they have Hogmanay, which is Scottish for the last day of the old year. There were many traditions for the special day, and although the twins had called Sodor home since 1959, they still missed their old home. Percy noticed this when Donald told him about it at the big station, and after Donald and Douglas left the yards with a long goods train, he told Sir Richard about him feeling homesick. So in a last-ditch effort, Sir Richard did his best to bring Scotland's Hogmanay celebrations to Sodor. However, the church's old bell was broken, and their new one had arrived on New Year's Eve at Barron Furnace, and no engine was available to deliver it due to everyone being busy. Thomas, who was shunting in the yards, was the only one available, and Sir Richard had asked him to deliver the bell. With all the signals cleared for Thomas and his special delivery, he collected the bell and made his way towards the big station. It was getting close to night time, and as Thomas neared Wellsworth, the points leading to the express line were jammed. However, Thomas came up with a solution by letting the signalman set him on the up line that leads to Barron Furnace. Despite it being dangerous, the plan had worked, and Thomas had made it to the station just in time. With the bell unloaded and taken straight to the church, Thomas joined the other engines to join the celebrations. Later, Donald and Douglas returned after delivering their goods train, and were surprised by the Scottish atmosphere of the party. They soon began to enjoy it. Later, it was time to ring in the new year, and with a new bell ringing and fireworks being blasted towards the sky, the year 2014 arrived, with Douglas bringing in the first footing at the sheds. 2014 started with Douglas coming back from delivering a midnight goods train to the other side of Sodor during a dark and stormy night. He stopped by Wellsworth to take shelter. Douglas was cross because the diesel had called the NWR old-fashioned and out of date, and he hoped that the diesel would be sorry one day. Then Boko told him about the time when he and Donald were terrible to him due to him being a so-called threat. However, Douglas didn't have much memory, and Boko explained. As the storm passed, Duck was sent to Edward Station to shunt around the yards. A diesel from the mainland needed a banker, and Duck pushed the diesel and his train up the hill. The diesel was impressed. In this episode, we had called Duck a Yorkshire-built engine, not as an insult, of course. However, upon our research, after this episode was made, Duck was actually built in Glasgow, Scotland, since according to records, GWR number 5741 Duck was built by the North British Locomotive Company. So when watching the episode nowadays, you have to think of the word Glasgow instead of Yorkshire. With what the diesel had mentioned, Duck was shocked to realise that he was built in Glasgow and not Swindon, but he chose not to believe it, which led to him not concentrating on his duties, which resulted in him crashing into some buffers. Sir Richard saw this and told Duck to stay in the shed until he had finished with his meeting at Wellsworth Station. After that, Duck told him about what the diesel had said. Sir Richard then told him the full truth, which made Duck feel very sad. He later met up with Henry and explained why he was sad. However, Henry told him that despite not being built at Swindon, he should be proud to be made from Swindon design. Duck realised that despite not being built at Swindon, he was still a Swindon design engine, and working on the Great Western Railway many years ago shows that he was still a true Great Western engine. Over in Australia, a new movie was being released at some Hoyt cinemas, showcasing Spills and Thrills, an upcoming annual tentpole DVD release that contained stories set aside from the television series. 6 episodes were shown with a certain theme from the 17th season that was based on the events from 1980. On Thomas's branch line back on Sodor, some children were playing football, soccer if you're from the United States and Australia, nearby the line in a field. However, Thomas would often worry about children being close to the line, which would send some nerves down his funnel. On his return journey, one of the children who was playing football earlier went to get his ball that had landed on the railway line after being kicked too hard. Thomas's driver was in shock when he saw him and applied the brakes. Thankfully, Thomas was leaving his station and wasn't going too fast, and had stopped just in time. However, the child was frightened, and the driver told the boys about the dangers of going onto a railway line without thinking of their safety first. So in the end, the boys played further away from the line. Later, Henry was taking a goods train to the mainland and would have to go through his forest, when he heard some gunshots in the distance from a couple of hunters. Henry wanted to stop them, but his driver told him if the hunters have a license, as required by law, then they couldn't do anything about it. The police were informed, but sadly couldn't find any trace of the hunters. Early the next morning, Henry caught up with the hunters who were trying to shoot a deer with a dog on their side. It turned out the hunters didn't have a license on them, and were hunting illegally, since one of them said to Henry's fireman, "A piece of paper is going to tell me what to do." Henry whooshed steam angrily at the hunters while the deer raced across the other side of the forest for safety. Percy came by too with a mail, and he blew steam at the hunters as well until the hunters had given up. Sir Richard praised Henry and Percy for their bravery, but Henry was worried that more hunters would come and hurt the animals in the forest, and so Sir Richard had come up with an idea and turned the forest into an animal reserve, named after Henry himself. Pip and Emma needed repairs, and someone must take the midnight express. James was returning to the big station after delivering a goods train and was asked to take the express train for the 2 high-speed units. But James's fireman had fallen ill, and there was no relief to take over from his duties. So Sir Richard Topham Hatt volunteered to help, which made James feel honoured. However, despite his hard work and determination, Sir Richard Topham Hatt had found that he wasn't the man that he used to be when it comes to firing steam engines. In the spring, Percy was cross that the passengers were blaming him for being late when it was a cow that blocked his path, and when he returned to the sheds later that evening, he was telling the others how horrible they were, until Daisy told about the time she had shot a cow all by herself when she was new to the railway in 1960. Over in the United States, the Special Director DVD special was released on March 4th, entitled Spills and Thrills, containing 6 stories from Series 17. It was later released in Australia on March 5th. However, they were given a story from the 14th season instead of the usual listing that was shown in cinemas in January. On the digital download version, they were given the episode The Tomaswa from the 17th season. It will later be released on Sodor in the mainland on March 24th. Later, a convention came to the island of Sodor focused on the popular science fiction television show Doctor Who. However, James thought the idea of the show about a time-traveling doctor sounded ridiculous. On the last day, James was tasked to collect a replica of the TARDIS, which was used on the show, ready for the finale of the convention. However, an accident happened with Henry, and Emily took the breakdown train to rescue him and to take him to the works. Because of it, Sir Richard had decided that Emily would bring the TARDIS instead since she was closer. But James wasn't told about the change, and went on to Barrow until he received the message over there, which left James very cross. However, Sir Richard had messaged the station master at Barrow that James was asked to go to the harbour, and so they did. Sir Richard and Emily thought to play a bit of a trick on James by surprising him as the 4th Doctor, who was famously played by Tom Baker, and tried to show James the fun of the show. But James wasn't convinced as the joke went a bit too far, as it resulted in him running off the rails after being surprised by the whole thing. The next day they apologised to James over their joke, and he took the passengers home after the convention. But when James saw someone dressed as a Dalek and said, "Exterminate!" he raced away with the driver, saying that not everyone has a similar taste. Meanwhile, over at the Bluebell on the mainland, Stepney's main steam pipe had failed and had withdrawn from service, and is now, as of 2022, a museum piece at the Bluebell. Over in the United States, Walmart had released a second exclusive DVD featuring 5 episodes from the upcoming 18th season called Trouble on the Tracks. In Japan, an exclusive stage production was made by Sony Creative Products called The Treasure of Sodor. As of 2022, this is the longest stage production based on the television series. On Sodor, it was raining, and Thomas was stuck at Toyrek Station due to a couple of landslips, one near the top station of his branch line and the other on the main line. To pass the time, his 2 coaches were telling him the time they first met. Every Easter Sunday, the Vicar of Wellsworth places chocolate eggs around the orchard for the children, and after their hunt, they get to ride on Trevor the traction engine. However, the head of the committee who had arranged the egg hunt with the vicar had retired, and a new person had taken their place. Her name was Mary Ida. She had moved to Sodor from the mainland. However, Miss Ida couldn't understand why a place like the island of Sodor still has steam-powered machinery, and when she saw Trevor, she decided that they would not be having him for the egg hunt. Duck was helping on Edward's branch line, and when Trevor told him about Mary Ida, his driver, who was also part of the committee, had planned with Jem Cole to at least let Trevor be part of the egg hunt, and that was placing eggs on his wheels. When the children spotted the eggs, they saw Trevor too, and wanted to ride on him. Miss Ida revoked the idea, but the parents of the children didn't mind, and so Miss Ida had no choice but to admit defeat. In the end, the children rode on Trevor, and they were having loads of fun, which gave Miss Ida a change of heart, and told the old traction engine that he'll be part of the egg hunt for the years to come. After many years of ownership, Caroline's master, who was the head of Elsbridge Cricket Club, had decided to sell Caroline due to her mechanical faults. However, it had pained him to tell her who her new owner would be. This made Caroline very upset, and she was worried that it could be the scrap. Bertie reassured her that her owner would never do that, but Caroline hoped to prove to her master that she still has years left in her. One day, Caroline's owner's family arrived and were about to see Henry off with a charter train. However, his granddaughter, Delia, waddled into one of Henry's coaches, and without the staff and family's knowledge, the door was closed and Henry puffed away after the guard blew his whistle. Caroline's owner's family noticed this and was shocked to realize that Delia was on the train. They went in Caroline and drove quickly away to catch up to Henry. Caroline did her best, but her engine was running hot, but she was determined because of the situation. But when they reached Wellsworth, she had failed. But her master had no time to worry and raced to the signalman. Caroline, however, thought that her master doesn't care for her anymore. Once Henry's train had stopped, everyone was happy that Delia was safe and sound. The next week, Caroline was sold, and she was sent to her new owner. It turned out that it was a transport museum near Crosby. Caroline was very happy, and to this day, she still lives at the museum. 2 years after its debut in Singapore and the Netherlands, the stage show Thomas and the Hidden Treasure had come to Australia. While Diesel and his siblings are still in service, a more modern Diesel had been built that was faster, stronger, and more advanced than the shunting engine himself. One of these modern types of Diesels came to the island to help with the extra work, while Pip and Emma were away at the works. His name was Shane. The new Diesel detested Diesel's presence and called him an out-of-date, useless object, which made Diesel very cross. Diesel in his case believes he's still revolutionary, but Shane didn't care and called him an old-timer. At Marin Station, Diesel was still cross, but Boko, who was at the station, told him this is just how the steam engines felt to him since Shane was a bit like himself when he was younger. But Diesel wanted to pay him out for insulting him. His driver then told him that Shane's classmates were all nicknamed Buckets. Diesel thought it was very funny, and when he passed through the big station, Diesel said, "If it ever rains, I know a good bucket when I see one," which left Shane fuming as he took the express. The next morning, Diesel was taking the morning goods train. James was originally supposed to take it, but his safety valve was jammed. Diesel wanted to prove that he was strong as ever, especially to Shane. But as he neared Wellsworth, his engine broke down due to the heavy strain of the goods train. His driver called for help and Stanley took him to Wellsworth Station. Sir Richard Topham Hatt came to see him and Diesel explained. Sir Richard just had enough with Diesel. He kept on promising that he would act his age, but then he would go back into his habit. So, Diesel was instead sent to the National Railway Museum to be repaired, and he would stay there until he learns how to respect steam engines. He then spoke to Shane about his arrogant behaviour, and Shane was apologetic to the other engines, and he gets on well with them. He even apologised to Diesel, and the two became good friends. Later, Diesel was sent to York. However, we don't know what happened over there. Mavis had been pulling trains from the quarry to the top station on Thomas's branch line ever since saving Toby from a broken bridge back in 1963. She had only spent time away from the quarry whenever she needs repairs or for some special occasion, but most of the time she spends her life at the quarry, which was rather dull for her. The last time she had crossed over Farquhar was back in 1995 for the Golden Jubilee celebrations of the Finn Clergyman's books. One day she grew tired and wished in front of the trucks that she could go beyond the top station whenever she feels like it. This gave the trucks an idea. As Mavis took a stone train to the top station for Percy, they bumped Mavis hard down the hill, knocking her driver and guard off the train and making her a runaway. Percy saw this and was surprised. Then Mavis and her guard ran towards Percy and spoke to him and his crew, and after talking to the station master, they raced away to catch Mavis. All trains were stopped so Mavis can be let through since she was out of control. Percy was growing tired, but he pressed on. Then at the big station, Stanley was shunting some trucks to make it a stopping barrier for Mavis, while the station master evacuated the passengers out of the station for their safety. Mavis arrived at the big station and saw the trucks and braced herself for the impending crash. But then she ran out of fuel and stopped just before the station platform. Percy arrived feeling very tired but was glad that Mavis was safe. Toby came by with some empty trucks for the quarry and was surprised to see Percy and Mavis together. They soon explained about their escapade, and Mavis learned to be careful what she wished for. In the end, Toby offered to take the two engines and his train to the top station. The manager heard about the incident but knew it wasn't Mavis's fault, and after hearing from her about wanting to go beyond Farquhar, the manager and Sir Richard Topham Hatt agreed to allow Mavis to do that when either Toby or Percy are ill or busy. However, her first run beyond the top station was rather rocky. After Mavis took the trucks down to the harbour, she was to take the workmen to the quarry for Toby after the tram engine was suffering from boiler rate due to some bad water. Mavis was surprised and amazed by the busy activity of the big station, and when the signal went down, she started suddenly. The signal was, however, for Henry. Mavis was surprised and very upset with her driver. She was, however, very lucky as she was fitted with TPWS, Train Protection and Warning System, which stops her automatically if she had passed a red signal. Her driver was an impatient man and wanted to get things done quickly. After getting permission from the signalman, Mavis rolled back to the station. After arriving at the quarry, the manager spoke to Mavis's driver crossly and told him that Sir Richard had arranged an inspector to teach him about the signal gantry first thing in the morning. The driver thought he doesn't need to be taught about signals, but Mavis just ignored him. The next day, Mavis arrived at Lower Tidmouth and picked up the inspector. At the big station, Mavis waited for her signal, but the driver was too impatient and pulled the throttle, resulting in Mavis being derailed. Help soon came, but Sir Richard and the inspector were very cross, and so was the quarry manager. With that, the manager fired the driver. In the end, Mavis was given a new driver who was entirely different from the previous driver, and with that, she was able to run trains smoothly towards the big station. With Diesel being away, Sir Richard Topham Hatt had bought an engine named Rosie from the Bluebell Railway. However, Thomas wasn't keen on seeing an engine like this, as her class had replaced the E2s. He was very cold towards Rosie, and she couldn't understand why. She asked the other engines in the shed, but they hadn't the foggiest, which left Rosie all in thought during the night. The next day, she made the trains late due to a lack of sleep, and Sir Richard had placed her in a siding so she can rest. Toby knew who Rosie was the previous day, and wondered why she was so tired, and when the little pink engine told him about Thomas, Toby knew why and explained about Thomas's classmates being all scrapped, and how he, Thomas, and even Sir Richard thought Rosie's classmates had replaced them. Rosie was sad to hear that and wanted to tell Thomas that she was sorry, but also that he couldn't be angry about something from the past now that it had been done. Sir Richard overheard this and had arranged for Thomas and Rosie to take the morning goods the next day. Thomas wasn't pleased, but Sir Richard had made up his mind. Rosie tried to talk to Thomas, but to no avail when they stopped at Crosby Station, as Boker had blocked their path after being derailed after delivering the midnight goods. Rosie told Thomas that despite her and her siblings replacing Thomas and his brothers, even her and her siblings weren't so lucky too, and that the past was in the past. Thomas felt bad and sorry for Rosie, and in the end, the two became good friends. However, after making their amends, they were in for a shocking discovery. It turned out that the E2s were never replaced by the USA dock tank engines to begin with. Yes, their short wheelbase had made them ideal, but the E2s were still reliable shunters around Southampton docks, despite being poor performers. The main reason enginemen preferred Rosie's class is because they had radios to communicate with other drivers around the dockyard. Thomas had felt silly for listening to silly stories, and so did Sir Richard after realizing the truth of it all. Despite Thomas being more apologetic, Rosie smiled and told Thomas that it was alright. During her time on Sodor, Rosie met Daisy, who was very rude to her as she was covered in the smell of fish, as some had landed on her while shunting the flying kipper. However, Rosie didn't mind how she smelled, she just wanted to get the work done. But Daisy thought appearances mattered more than physical traits. For an engine would mean running power, strength, and ability. Rosie was annoyed by Daisy's down talk, and later that day Daisy was annoyed by Rosie's words. And as she arrived at Farquhar, she saw Percy's trucks left in a siding. It turned out Percy had a cracked cylinder, and that Toby was to look after his shunting duties while Mavis takes his stone trains. Thomas was still taking his passengers, and so that meant Daisy was the only engine left to pull it, much to her disdain, and dust from the trucks flew onto her paintwork. But they took the trucks to the harbour for the morning goods. As she arrived, Rosie was there waiting, and she thought Daisy pulling trucks looked very funny. Daisy was sad that her paint was ruined by dust. However, the station master was pleased with Daisy as the morning goods was almost delayed due to Percy's cracked cylinder. But with Daisy making good time, she had managed to deliver the trucks on time. And in the end, Daisy learned that an engine's physical trait matters. Gordon's Hill is the steepest grade on the main line, and usually when a train is long or heavy, a banker would do the job of helping the train to go up the steep slope. Shane was to take an express train, and he was waiting for his new guard to give him the all-clear whistle. Shane was not happy as the new guard was late and thought he was being very inexperienced, but his driver had told him it was early days. At last, the new guard came and blew his whistle and waved his green flag. However, he was well behind schedule thanks to the guard, but the passengers had blamed Shane instead. He told the whole thing to Donald, but the Scottish engine told him that the guard was just making mistakes, and how making mistakes is how we learn things. The next day, Shane went smoothly with the express and was on time. Shane thought the new guard must have learnt from his mistakes after all, but it wouldn't last long. As he rolled up Gordon's Hill, he felt himself slowing down, but he managed to reach the top. At Marin, it was found out at the end that the new guard had screwed the brakes hard because he thought they would roll down the hill. No one said a word, and they rolled away. But Shane said it was early days yet. As for the guard, he's still working on the line, but he had learned not to screw the brakes on any train on any hill. He's now fully experienced compared to what he was back in 2014. Meanwhile, Stanley was being cocky about pushing a diesel up the hill with 30 coal wagons. He was told by the diesel that he had a fear going up the hill with a long load, and Stanley scoffed at it, saying that a hill is just a hill. Tomas soon brought him back down to earth when he told about the time he was scared of hills when he first came to Sodor. As the summer months arrived, Rosie had an accident with some trucks as the cleaner had left her regulator opened, and she fell into the sea at the harbour and was sent to the works. The next day, Shane was rather opinionated. He respects the engines, but thought all of them should have been fitted with automatic brakes like him. But James told her that they weren't fitted all with 21st century technology because of heritage purposes, which Shane scoffed at. Henry thought he would soon learn that technology of today can't be perfect as well, and that's what happened. Shane's driver was having lunch with the signalman as they were taking a mail van for a refit to the works. A chock was placed beneath his wheels, but the driver had forgotten about the hand and air brake, and later Shane started to roll down the hill and crash into some coaches at Lower Tidmouth. In the end, Shane learned that today's technology can't be perfect as well. Gordon was away to be fitted with a new boiler that was coming from Germany, and James and Henry was looking after his local trains. But they soon grew bored of puffing slowly and stopping at each station, until Toby, who was helping Rosie with the shunting at the big station, came along and told them to stop and smell the roses, meaning stop, slow down, and look at the pleasures of life. James and Henry were confused from what Toby was saying, and he offered to show it to James when pulling the local service. At first, James grew bored and wanted to get on fast, but when he saw a fisherman catching a fish, he thought different and started to appreciate the things of life. James told Henry, and the big green engine started to understand Toby's saying. Later, Douglas was taking Toad the brake van to the works to have new brakes fitted, as his old ones had failed. With him gone, Douglas would have to find a new brake van until Toad was mended. He received a nasty surprise when the only brake van available was the spiteful brake van. After Douglas's accident with the van on Gordon's Hill, the van was repaired and had been used for the scrap train. He was on the same train that Berko had hauled that ended up splitting an old truck apart in 1990, which can be seen in the 1991 annual. But the van was causing trouble. As Douglas was to push him out of the yards, the van had asked his guard to put his brakes on, which resulted in Douglas's wheels slipping. Jeff the Works diesel was called to take the van to the Little Western, and to Douglas's surprise and frustration, the van moved quite fluently. But the van was still causing trouble for Douglas on the Little Western, as Douglas was to take some ballast to the harbour at the big station. At first, the driver thought something might be wrong with the van's brakes, but nothing wrong was found. Each time as they moved along on their journey, the van's brakes were still holding Douglas back. The van's behaviour had resulted in the ship that was to take the ballast leaving without its delivery. Douglas told the harbour station master about the van holding him back, but he didn't believe him, and told Douglas to shunt the ballast trucks into a siding. Douglas had even told Sir Richard about the van, but he too didn't believe him as well. Douglas came back to the shed feeling sad and tired, and he told the other engines about the spiteful brake van. He wished he hadn't put so much pressure on him when he was pushing James and his train up the hill. However, Donald had told him that it was only an accident, and thought if the van did that to him, he would teach him a lesson or two, just like how he did when they first came to Sodor. And Douglas soon had an idea. The next day, he was taking some goods to the harbour, and as the van's brakes were coming on to hold him back, Douglas's driver had opened the regulator wide open and puffed on fast while the van's wheels screeched along the line, making an awful noise. The van hated it and told his guard to put the brakes off, but it was jammed. At the harbour, the brakes were fixed and the van's wheels ached. The van or Douglas didn't say a word. Later that day, the van apologised to Douglas for holding a grudge and for delaying his train, and to his guard as well for making him play his tricks. Both accepted his apology, and after Toad was repaired, the two became friends ever since. Speaking of brake vans, Shane was one day complaining about the use of them and boasted about automatic brakes once again. It seemed that his lesson about technology was thrown out of the window. The trucks wanted to play a trick on him so they could teach him a lesson about brake bands. One of the trucks had tricked a workman into thinking that the brake band had jammed brakes and needed to be uncoupled. The guard didn't know when it was time to leave. He was surprised that he was left behind. Shane was having the time of his life since nothing was happening to him on his journey. But when an electrical wire burst, causing his throttle and emergency brake to fail, he became a runaway. The trucks hadn't planned this, but had pushed him with all their strength until he was derailed. Sir Richard was cross with Shane and asked him about the brake band. However, the trucks giggled and Sir Richard noticed and pinned the blame on them. The trucks were worried, and when Sir Richard told them they could be part of the scrap train, they admitted that they had tricked the foreman into uncoupling the brake band. So as punishment, they were to be part of the scrap train for a while, and Shane soon learnt his lesson about brake bands. Meanwhile, over in Australia, the DVD special for 2014, Tale of the Brave, was the first country to release the movie in cinemas, recapping the story that happened back in 1966. Over in Japan, the Origaya Railway had debuted their C11 type locomotive as the television counterpart of Thomas in Shimada in the Shizuoka Prefecture. More characters would follow suit, whereas at the making of this video, the railway had recently introduced a replica of Toby's TV counterpart, although it was a diesel. Despite some conflict on the island, the year 2014 was a special year for the Northwestern Railway. It was the centennial year of the railway's establishment, and Sir Richard Topham Hatt had organised a special celebration at the big station, with displays, demonstrations and rides, and to top it all, a special royal train from the mainland, with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, Prince William and Princess Catherine on board. Sir Richard gave the honour to Thomas and Edward for being the first engines of the NWR to pull the train. Meanwhile, the rest were to carry on duties as usual. In addition, a diesel from York was coming to bring enthusiasts for a nighttime photo session on the day of the gala. But despite the upcoming celebrations, work carries on, and Edward was to take some china clay to the harbour at the big station. But his driver noticed that Edward's tender had sprung a leak, and that he had to stop as running a tender without water can be very dangerous. Meanwhile, Thomas was experiencing a failed water injector, and they had to stop as it was also dangerous since water needed to be transferred from the tanks to the boiler. When Sir Richard heard the news, he thought of cancelling the photo session, but Edward pleaded with him and told him that they can be there at the photo session and will then be taken to the works afterwards. But of course that means missing out on the party and the royal train. Thomas and Edward were taken to the works, and Sir Richard had arranged a visiting diesel, who was named Patrick, to take the royal train instead. Patrick picked up the royal train and rolled away until his traction motor had failed, and he had to stop right on the bridge between Vickerstown and Barrow-in-Furness. Help soon came, and it was none other than Thomas and Edward. Thomas had his injectors unblocked, and Edward was given some strong steel placed over some rust over the leaky part of his tender. The two engines pulled Patrick to the workstation and took over the royal train. The two engines passed by many onlookers who waved and cheered as the royal train passed. They arrived at the big station with engines and passengers waving, cheering and whistling, while the brass band played congratulations as the two founding engines pulled in. Speeches were made, with Prince William being pleased that despite flaws, helpfulness is still something on the NWR, and in which Sir Richard, on behalf of the royal family, all the best in the years to come for the railway, and that his engines and railway are a credit to him and the people of Sodor. After the celebrations, things went back to normal as usual. Emily was taking a goods train when she saw an enthusiast standing on the line side. This frightened Emily, but the man moved to a safe location after taking his photograph. She was quite shaken after the whole thing as she was taking on water at Crosby. Boko sympathized with her and understood the situation. The next day, Emily was taking a mail train when she spotted the enthusiast again. Her driver had enough and reported it to the police. The police told them that they would be investigating the matter, but report to them if they have any evidence. This gave Emily's driver an idea, and when they spotted the enthusiast again, the driver took his picture and gave it to the police. The enthusiast was soon found and was to pay a fine for trespassing. The enthusiast learned his lesson, and since that day stands on platforms and bridges. James was taking some trucks for his slow goods train and was waiting at the junction for Percy and his trucks. But Percy was late thanks to the trucks, but James blamed Percy because according to him, branch line engines are always slow and late, and everything from there should move to the main line. Percy was cross and retorted to James about the time he wanted a branch in 1989, which can be found in the 1990 annual. James then told him that branch lines were vulgar. This made Percy cross, and he bumped the trucks behind James, which made him cross. However, Percy's cylinder head was knocked off, and after his driver gave him a temporary fix, Percy delivered his empty milk wagons to the dairy and was then taken to the work station. Sir Richard had then placed James to look after Percy's work, much to the Red Engine's displeasure. James sulked, and when he reached Farquhar he collected a stone train, ready for Rosie's slow goods, and had to wait for his path after Thomas, Daisy and Toby head off with their work. To pass the time, James shunted trucks for Toby. After that, James was to take his train, but he was late and had to make up for lost time. But the troublesome trucks were causing trouble. At last he arrived at the junction late and Rosie was cross. James understood how Percy felt being talked down for being late. Over time, James began to enjoy running a branch line and had learned how important they were to the island. And when Percy returned from the works, James left with a brand new respect for branch lines. Over in London on the mainland, Tale of the Brave was released in cinemas with a special premiere party with over 300 guests, including some well-known names and their children, and 30 members of the Audrey family attended the showing. Mark Morahan, the storyteller of the television series, had also attended the premiere with his family as well. The engines were also given a screening at the big station and were met with praise, despite some of the inaccuracies. Back on Sodor, Thomas and Bertie loved racing each other, but one day Thomas was late due to a broken signal arm, and Bertie took his passengers for him. When Thomas reached the top station, Bertie began to boast about how roads are better than railways. Thomas, who was still cross about being late, fumed by Bertie's joke and ignored Bertie for the rest of the day. His foul mood hadn't changed, and after being reasoned with by Toby and Percy, Thomas decided to apologize to Bertie for ignoring him. The next day he found Bertie broken down on the crossing due to a broken exhaust pipe. A new one was waiting for him at the top station and no tow trucks were available. So Thomas decided to push him to the top station. When he did, the other engines and passengers were surprised. Bertie was pleased and was sorry for offending Thomas the other day, and Thomas apologized too for ignoring him. Over on the mainland, the 18th season of the television series had been broadcasted on television across the mainland, the British Isles and on Sodor, with the first episode, Old Reliable Edward. The engines were given a special screening and they were in praise of the new season, even saying that it was better than the last. The series ran until September, leaving the Christmas and winter episodes for December of that year. It would then be broadcasted in Australia and Japan that October. However, the United States wouldn't get the new series until May 2015. Meanwhile, over on the mainland, the newest special was released across the nation in cinemas. A couple of days after that, it was released on iTunes as a digital download, and after that it was released on DVD over on the mainland and on Sodor. Mrs. Kindly had been a very good friend to the railway, especially to the engines on Thomas's branch line, but sadly she was aging and would often spend her time in her house. However, despite her limited capabilities, she still goes out with her husband in a wheelchair and would often smile at people and engines. But one night, Reginald Kindly needed an emergency. Mrs. Kindly had fallen from a set of stairs and had damaged her hip. She needed a hospital fast and had asked Thomas to take her to Wellsworth since it was too far for them to get there in time. So Thomas's crew had helped Reginald to carry Mrs. Kindly, and Thomas, who was given special permission, ran towards Wellsworth, pushing his coaches backwards. Stanley and Edward were surprised to see him. When Thomas told the two the story, they were worried, but Edward seemed to doubt that Mrs. Kindly will survive. But Thomas had hoped that she would have a different turnout. But the next morning, Sir Richard Topham Hatt gave some somber news. Mrs. Kindly passed away at Wellsworth Hospital at the age of 91 on Wednesday, September 3rd, 2014. It was a quiet autumn morning as they went about their work, and Thomas was trying to reel in the idea that Mrs. Kindly was gone for good. Thomas was depressed that day, and they met up with Gordon at the junction. He told her that maybe he was wrong to hope, which made Gordon cross. He told Thomas that although it was never wrong to hope, it's best to be realistic as well with the fate that had happened while Mrs. Kindly was in their thoughts. Thomas had trouble sleeping that night, and he began to think of Gordon's words. The next morning, Thomas was asked to bring Isabella, the Kindly's daughter, and Jessica, the Kindly's granddaughter, to Dryle Airfield to get ready for the funeral that was to happen the next day. Thomas offered his sympathies to them and then smiled at the thought that Mrs. Kindly was in a much better place and knew that in the end that she was in their thoughts forever, just like what Gordon had said to him. The funeral arrived, and because Thomas had helped Mrs. Kindly to go to the hospital, he was given the honour of hauling the funeral train. Everyone gave Mrs. Kindly a final whistle of salute as she made her final journey to Titmuss Cemetery, where she would rest in eternal peace. After the funeral, Reginald's family stayed on Sodor for several more days to keep their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather company until they had to go home, and in honor of their long friendship with Mrs. Kindly, the family had agreed to the NWR to name the limited service the Kindly Limited. Meanwhile, in the United States, Tale of the Brave was released on digital download. It didn't have a cinema release unlike Australia and the mainland due to lack of sponsor to show the movie. However, it was released on digital download on iTunes, and then on DVD and Blu-ray a week after its digital release. It was then later released on US television on PBS Kids in November. However, some scenes had to be shortened or cut to fit for time slots. Also released in the US alongside the 2014 special was another Walmart exclusive called Engines to the Rescue, which featured 5 episodes from the 17th season. This was also released in Greece. A month after the Walmart exclusive, the United States was given another Christmas DVD called The Christmas Engine, with stories based on the events from 1982. Meanwhile, on Sodor, a mysterious engine had come to the island, and he was a rare engine. His name was William, and he was found derailed near Crosby Station. He was sent to Crowbensgate but was quiet after his accident. When he was repaired, Sir Richard sent him to the big station to help with Rosie's shunting, but he was still quiet amongst the other engines. But when Oliver arrived at the big station, he was surprised to see William. The last time the two engines had met was when they were both working on a branch line at Rawburn in the Western region. It had been a long time since they last saw each other, and Oliver assumed that he had been scrapped. Oliver was wondering why he was on Sodor, but William just puffed away. During the whole day, he began to warm up to the other engines, but remained quiet about his presence on the island. While his crew went to town on lunch break, someone mysteriously climbed into his cab and moved him towards some buffers, but for some reason William had stopped. He was surprised. Sir Richard had told him that they will investigate the matter, and later that day Sir Richard had arranged for William, with the approval of Oliver, to take one of Oliver's rush hour trains to clear his mind over the near miss. But as his crew went to grab some coffee, William's wheels began to move again, and this time he ran away right towards Alsborough. But then he stopped again. He was relieved, but the passengers were cross. William had no idea what was happening as Oliver chased after him with William's crew on board. That night, William was shocked to see a familiar figure coming towards him and screaming. This had woken the other engines up, and William told them about him, but they found no one there. All William could do was go to sleep again. The next morning, Sir Richard then told William that a man named John Harworth had passed away at the same ravine where William was found, but William was confused. He said he saw him the previous night. It turned out that the mysterious figure was William's owner, and that he was in bankruptcy and had set out to destroy William, so that his bank wouldn't get him. John Harworth was very possessive and wanted no one to have William, hence why he wanted him destroyed. The poor old engine was bought by him many years ago, but it was left in storage around Baron Furness due to John's laziness and stingy attitude. William raced to the sheds and knew in the end he must confront him. He knew that the two incidents were John's doing. That night he waited in the yards for his owner, and when he came, William stated that he was a terrible owner and told him to leave and never come back to cause harm to him ever again. Harworth went away and he was never seen again. William was finally at peace. However, Duck was wondering why John was out to destroy him, but didn't have the chance at the big station or on the Little Western. William thought that he might not want to have someone witness it, and wanted to do it alone with no one about. But William was very happy with the new life on Sodor. In November, Shane was waiting to take an express train. He then saw Rosie, who pulled into the big station. She told him that she was to bring some World War II veterans to the big station tomorrow for the annual Remembrance Day service. Shane never really understood the day and thought it was over-glorifying war. However, one veteran named Roy Shepard told him about the infamous Sodor Blitz. In the end, Shane soon learned why the day was so important. More businesses and factories were being opened on Thomas's branch line, and that means more and more work for Percy the small engine. He hated it as he had to do the goods work as well as the shunting all on his own. Percy didn't mind the extra work, but he was soon tired of it all and wanted another engine to help. Thomas teased Percy that he was just afraid of hard work and was lazy, despite Toby reminding him of his fib in 2013. But Percy had decided to go on strike to make his voice heard. He couldn't steam well the next morning, and despite his crew and the inspector's best efforts into starting him up, there was nothing they could do, and had arranged the other engines to do his work. Toby and Daisy were to look after the passengers, and Thomas was to look after the goods work. As Thomas took a stone train from the quarry to the harbour at the big station, he saw the trucks at the harbour, and while I understood that Percy wasn't kidding about the extra work, he thought he could do it easy. But he was wrong. Later that day, Sir Richard came to see Percy and wasn't pleased by his behaviour, but when Thomas told Sir Richard about the workload that Percy had to endure, Sir Richard smiled and understood Percy's words, as of course he said that while protesting gets what we desire, but sometimes it doesn't. But it was not a sin to fight for what is right. He told Percy about the various businesses and factories complaining about their shipments being delayed, and he would inspect the workload at the harbour. Things would go back to normal for Thomas, and the little blue engine had apologised to Percy for his teasing. The next day Sir Richard saw the problem, and decided to bring in another engine to help with Percy, and that was of course Stanley. With Stanley now working on Thomas's branch line, a new engine was to look after the goods yard at Wellsworth, and of course had decided to bring Diesel back after 6 months away at York's Railway Museum. There were still some trust issues with Diesel when he arrived at Wellsworth, but he went about doing his work. Edward had asked about Diesel's time at the NRM, but the Diesel shunter said nothing, and instead of arguing, Edward just went to sleep instead. A Diesel had come from the mainland with a tour from Pathfinder. This was, however, a Diesel that many engines remembered way back in the 1960s. It was D199, or infamously known as Spam Can. Bear, who was waiting with the Kindly Limited, was surprised to see him. He was still the same Diesel that he was back then. Later that day he was to take a goods train, but the other engines stayed away from him, but Spam Can didn't care. With Stanley being sent away to Thomas's line, Edward was back banking trains, and he had to be very careful. He was to help Spam Can with his train, but when he reached the hill, Edward's wheels had slipped, and then one of his tyres, which was used for grip, had snapped and gone right into his boiler, causing him immense pain. He was then sent to the works. Spam Can rolled down the hill and ordered Diesel to bank his train. Diesel scowled at D199 and pushed him up the hill. Spam Can thought Edward's misfortune was very funny, but Diesel told him to shut up and act his age and respect Edward, as he was Spam Can's elder. This surprised the Diesel as he rolled away. After D199 had left, and Edward had returned from the works with a repaired boiler and wheel tyre, he heard about Diesel defending him, and was rather impressed by it, and said there must be some good in him after all after his time in York. But Diesel just said that Edward was crazy, but we know, don't we? Over in the United States, the DVD Signals Cross was released, which contained 5 episodes from the 18th season. It will be released over on the mainland in Sodor in January 2016, and in February 2017 in Australia. Christmas is a special time of year for family and friends, but it can be a rather hard time as well for people who are far away from family and have lost a loved one, like Reginald Kindly. After his family had returned to the mainland, they had faced loss themselves. His granddaughter was having marital problems, and his daughter was having money problems from her work and couldn't come to Sodor for Christmas. Thomas felt terrible for Reginald and wanted to help, but he nor his friends couldn't do anything, although Sir Richard had overheard the problem and decided to help. He had made last-minute arrangements to bring Reginald's family to Sodor for Christmas, and Harold flew towards the mainland to take the dry all funded by Sir Richard Topham Hatt. Meanwhile, the engines were all lined up in a cavalcade taking passengers to the annual carol concert at the big station. Thomas was sent to Dryall and was surprised to find Reginald's daughter, granddaughter, and the Kindly's great-granddaughter Michelle at the station. They did not know who had brought them to the island, but were glad to be on Sodor for Christmas. Isabella told Thomas that they were to meet up with her father at the cottage, and when they arrived, Thomas blew his whistle happily, and Reginald was surprised to see them. Jessica then told him that they were to head to the big station for the concert. At the big station, Sir Richard Topham Hatt had made the Kindly family their guest of honour, and told them that Christmas is all about putting effort into the kindness and sharing of the whole day to make someone happy. Thomas took the Kindly family home, and Sir Richard and his wife had given them a tree, some presents, and even some food for their Christmas dinner. Reginald was pleased, and so was his family, and gave their thanks to Sir Richard and Thomas. Although Reginald was sad that his wife was not here with them, Isabella assured him that maybe their mother was glad to see them together. And when Thomas puffed into the shed, he looked at the sky and wished Mrs. Kindly Merry Christmas, and then went to sleep. 2015 was a very important year for the engines on the North Western Railway. The year marked the 70th anniversary of the Railway Series books. However, despite it being the anniversary year, it was also another year of work for the engines on Sir Richard's Railway. Starting in the new year, Donald was asked by Sir Richard to look after Shane's goods and passengers while his cooling system was being repaired. However, while waiting for his train to be arranged, his driver was sneezing as he caught a cold. Donald was worried, but his driver told him that he was fine, until he let out a big sneeze and ran into the firemen, knocking them both out, and Donald had become a runaway until he was derailed into a field at Gordon's Hill. The guard ran to check on the crew and found themselves on the floor in the cab. He telephoned the emergency services, and when they came, he ran back to the station to get help. Diesel came to take Donald and the trucks away back to Wellsworth, while the emergency services took Donald's crew to the hospital at Wellsworth. They regained consciousness after they arrived and wondered what had happened. They stayed in the hospital for a while as Donald was at the works to be checked over. When the day came, they returned to work with Donald once again. When it was found out that the driver's sneezing had caused Donald's runaway, Sir Richard then told him that the next time he comes down with one, he should look after himself at home. Over the years, the Flying Kipper had seen some changes. For a year it was a non-stop fish service to Manchester, but with a steam locomotive being required to gain special permission nowadays, the Kipper now serves all the shops around the island, with some stops at some junctions so that vans from the train can be taken by the branch line engines for the shops in the various towns and villages. The fish for the mainland, however, is transferred by lorry instead. One day, Henry was tasked to take a heavy goods train to the mainland, with permission obtained of course, and Thomas was tasked to take the Kipper for him and would have to spend the night at the mainline sheds. Gordon and the other engines were surprised to see him. When Thomas told the big blue engine about taking the Kipper for Henry, Gordon belittled the train, thinking that it wasn't important, nor stylish or luxurious. But Thomas ignored him. Early the next morning, Thomas puffed into the harbour feeling tired and sleepy. This was too early for him, but as he puffed into the dockyard, he puffed into a pallet of fish, making it spilt everywhere around him. When it was all cleaned up and the rails had been sanded, Thomas puffed away, but he reeked with the smell of fish. His coaches and passengers didn't like the smell, and Thomas had to explain. Then Gordon came into view, laughing when he smelt the smell. Later, Sir Richard had sent Thomas to be washed, and while Thomas was glad to have a clean, he wanted to pay Gordon out. But all that happened before he thought of a plan, as Sir Richard had asked him to take the Kipper instead. Gordon was shocked and asked about Henry. Sir Richard told Gordon that Henry had been delayed on the mainland and that he will be staying at a heritage railway for the night before he returns. So Gordon was to take the Kipper despite him not liking the idea of pulling it. Gordon told his driver to add more steam in him so they can deliver the fish fast, and when he delivered the vans and fish to various stations, he was almost done as he came towards the hill. He was pleased, but as he came to the top, a coupling broke and the van started to roll down the steep slope without Gordon knowing. Gordon was warned about the vans by the workmen, but he was so cross and stubborn that he didn't listen. As he stopped at Marin, the vans crashed into Gordon, pushing him beyond the station platform with fish thrown everywhere. Boko had taken the remaining vans, and Diesel took Gordon back to the big station. Thankfully, Gordon wasn't damaged by the crash, but Sir Richard was cross and told Gordon that he won't be washed down after not listening to the workmen about the vans. He met up with Thomas, who had the last laugh. A few days later, the 2015 straight-to-DVD release of 6 season 18 episodes came out and was entitled Dinos and Discoveries, with a special trailer to kick off the 70th anniversary celebrations of a new mini-special called The Adventure Begins. That was to come out later in the year, a recreation of Thomas's early days on Sodor. However, the trailer had a few liberties, but the engines were very excited. A week after Thomas and Gordon's Kipper incidents, Boko's driver was retiring after many years of service, and so a special celebration was made for him that night by Sir Richard Topham Hatt at the hotel near the big station. The next day, Boko saw a man in a blue uniform walking around in the yard. Boko thought he was lost until he was told that he was his new driver. Although he had worked with some types of diesel, he prefers steam engines as he had come from a heritage railway on the mainland. Things didn't roll off smoothly for Boko. He went backwards instead of forward, and he would often have his brakes slammed on when trying to stop at some stations at full speed. However, things started to improve, and the new driver had become stubborn and proud. They came through Wellsworth. However, it was supposed to be one of the stops with the Kindly Limited. Boko tried telling his new driver, but he wasn't listening, and they were surprised when Boko was turned onto Edward's branch line, because although they sped through the station, they were very early, and the line beyond Wellsworth hadn't been set for him. They came to Sudbury and had stopped, but Edward was in their way. The driver honked Boko's horn crossly like a passenger getting angry at a car that had stopped in front of him. Sir Richard came towards Boko and was surprised to see him. His driver soon realized that he was at fault for not being on the main line. Boko was embarrassed, and Gordon and James were teasing him. However, Boko soon told them their incidents involving branch lines and put them in their place. Boko told Sir Richard that he didn't want to work with his new driver, but Sir Richard told him that they must give him a second chance. So he reluctantly agreed, but everyone had cast so much doubt. The new driver made sure that he would always listen to Boko, but when Boko saw a group of cows, he told his driver to stop. And he did. The passengers were cross, but when the guard told him about the cows, Boko was pleased that his driver had kept to his promise of listening to him. Derek had come to the island of Sodor back in 1973 from the Derby Railway Research Centre on the mainland. However, like his classmates, he had suffered from teething troubles such as camshaft and cylinder head problems, which had caused lots of headaches to the late Sir Charles Topham Hatt and sent him back to Derby. A Heritage Railway group had bought him after retiring from Derby in 1978, but couldn't come up with the money to buy the line in 1979. He was left on the scrap road for a few years until Sir Stephen Topham Hatt bought him in 1998. However, it wouldn't be until 2015 when he was brought back into service. Derek was to help with work while Shane was still away at the works. He was taking a goods train to the mainland, but it failed with a jammed cylinder after reaching the top of Gordon's Hill. But despite that, Sir Richard had told Derek that he would be given another chance and was to be repaired. Derek was pleased. He hoped that this time he would not experience any more failures. Ari and Bert had teased about his failures, but Diesel stepped in and defended Derek in front of the two scrap Diesels. Ari and Bert rolled away, seeing that Diesel was defending someone instead of playing along like he used to with them. Derek, however, was pleased, but wished he had defended himself on his own. However, irony had gotten to them as Ari and Bert's cylinders were jammed as they were making their way towards Croc's scrapyard near Wellsworth. Derek was still cross, and when he rescued the two types of diesels, he hoped that they learnt their lesson that even the improved design diesel can't always be perfect. Indeed they did. Derek was now repaired, and he hadn't experienced one failure ever since. Enthusiasts are all well and good, but some give others a bad reputation. Some feel angry that their shot was taken differently to act as if they were privileged. The engines do feel sorry for the ones that were concerned for others. One day Oliver had seen one of these enthusiasts being rude to the other at the big station when taking his auto train, but it had happened as he was leaving. He saw him again the next day when he was to look after Gordon's local train while Gordon was taking a special charter train. A young enthusiast who was visiting the island from America came rushing into the station to take a picture of Oliver and to board his train, but the other enthusiast yelled at him. The young one was apologetic, but the older one didn't care and yelled at him some more. Oliver was crossed by his behaviour. His driver promised him the next time they see him he will report him to the Sodor Transport Police. The same enthusiast from the big station was at Crosby as Oliver pulled into the station. However, another one was there too with a walking stick to support him. He was having trouble trying to balance himself while taking a picture, but the other enthusiast was getting very annoyed by him for bumping into him. However, it was an accident, of course. The enthusiast had threatened him, but the elderly man retorted back. The two men argued until Oliver told them to stop. The young enthusiast agreed with Oliver, and soon a policeman came towards him and arrested him for verbal abuse. Sir Richard was pleased with Oliver for standing up against the bully. It had been a month since the trailer for The Adventure Begins was released, and Thomas was still excited. He began to feel nostalgic about his early days, so he decided to be cheeky to whoever passed by. Thomas means well, but his teasing has caused great offence to the likes of Gordon, Henry, and Emily. Their crews discussed Thomas's behaviour and talked about it with Thomas's driver. The driver then told him that if he was cheeky again, he would leave him in the shed with no one to drive him. This made Thomas worried, but he couldn't help himself with his teasing and had teased James for being slow. The driver told Thomas that he apologised to James, though not like that he means it. Later that day, Thomas was stopped by sheep, and his driver was shooing them away until he was gone. Thomas and his fireman waited and waited for the driver to return. Soon the fireman went to go and find him. The fireman had been gone for a while, and so was the driver, and Thomas came to the idea that he was abandoned because of his cheekiness, and he began to cry. However, the fireman had returned and told him that the driver had broken his ankle after moving the sheep and that they must help him at once. They called for an ambulance to wait for them at the junction, and when his driver returned, Thomas promised that he would never be cheeky and would listen to his driver. As spring came, the quarry at Thomas's branch line was being blasted for some rock, and Percy was to take some empty trucks and a van of dynamite to the quarry. Diesel overheard Percy's curiosity about the dynamite and told Percy that if he did one bump, he would blow up like a firecracker and would then be sent to the scrapyard. Diesel was only joking, but Percy was very scared. When he puffed away, he was puffing very slowly towards the quarry, with Percy's excuse being to keep the trucks in line. When they reached the line towards the quarry, the gradient was high, and his slow speed were making him even slower, and the driver had had enough. He sped Percy up, much to Percy's protest, but he hit a fish plate hard, and then a blast was heard in the distance. Percy thought his load had exploded, but it didn't. Then the driver realized why Percy wanted to go slow, and told him that dynamite can't explode because it had no detonator. Percy was cross and doubted that Diesel had changed. His driver understood his feelings and began a plan to get back at Diesel. Diesel was ordered to take another train of explosives and empty trucks to the quarry, as Percy's train had exploded. Diesel was surprised and decided to be careful as he makes his way to the quarry. Percy's driver saw him approaching the quarry line and radioed one of the quarry workers for the blast. The site was cleared and the blast was made, and that had scared Diesel, much to the laughter of Percy, Diesel's driver, and the trucks. Diesel was cross, but Percy told him it served him right for tricking him. Then Percy told him that he had been good lately, but if he keeps up with his misbehaviour again, Sir Richard might send him back to York again, or he might never come back to Sodor. In the end, Diesel knew that Percy was right. Over in the United States, the first special for the year was released, but only at Walmart, as they did for Railway Mischief in 2013 and Trouble on the Track in 2014. This being, of course, The Adventure Begins. Alongside the movie, they released special battery-powered toys of Thomas being green and one being Glyn. The mainland was supposed to get it for the Asda stores, which are also owned by Walmart, around the same time, but was delayed until July later in the year. Work had been increasing during the spring, and Sir Richard Topham Hatt had decided to bring in another engine from a heritage railway to help Diesel in the yards. The engine doesn't have a name, just the number 13 on his side tank. Diesel was pleased to have some help, and the two engines worked hard in the yard, shunting trucks into their proper places. The trains run to time and the trucks were all on their best behaviour. 13 was a bit of an overexcited engine, and when Ben puffed into the station with some China clay trucks, he stopped just in time before Ben passed by. Ben decided to tease him about his number after seeing it on his side tanks, and told him that it was Friday the 13th. 13 doesn't believe it, but Ben kept on teasing him. 13 was cross, and as he biffed and banged the trucks, they soon misbehaved towards the other engines. As he was shunting some empty cattle wagons, he couldn't stop and bashed right into the buffers. No one was hurt, but 13 was damaged and would have to go to the works. The trucks, who had overheard his conversation with Ben, teased him about his luck. 13 told Sir Richard that he may have had bad luck because of his number and how he was built on Friday the 13th. He wished that he was scrapped, but Sir Richard told him not to put himself down, all because of some superstition, as of course Sir Richard had told him that there was one in February and one coming in November. It all turned out in the end that it was just a stiff handbrake. It was just something that had happened at random. 13 was repaired and was back at work. He saw Ben puffing back towards some buffers, and then he crashed into them, causing him to fall into a barge. 13 teased him, but Ben had said nothing in the end. One morning, Gordon was shocked to realize that he was tasked to take a slow goods train. Of course, he has a strong dislike for them, and he refused to move, but the crew reminded him of what had happened to him at Vickerstown back in 1952, and so Gordon did as he was told. He took the trucks, and off he went. Gordon was being very impatient as he waited for each engine to shunt trucks onto his train. He collected more trucks until he reached Wellsworth. Diesel was supposed to arrange and help with Gordon's train, but a last-minute change was made and there was no help at all. Gordon would have to shunt his train instead, which made him red in the face. But despite his protest, he did it anyway. But Gordon had an idea. Instead of uncoupling the brake van and collecting the wagons, Gordon thought they should push the whole train towards the waiting trucks, as that would save loads of time. But the foreman had placed the turntable in the wrong direction, and Gordon's trucks were derailed, and some had fallen into the well, damaging the turntable. Gordon nor his crew noticed this until the guard blew his whistle. They finally stopped, But the turntable was out of commission. Sir Richard was very cross with Gordon, and as punishment he was to pull slow goods until he learned about the importance of shunting trains. One day, Stanley was making his way to the harbour on Thomas's branch line when he saw something shooting across the sky. His driver told him that it was a model rocket. Stanley was amazed and told him and Daisy at the top station about always liking the idea of going to space, ever since Neil Armstrong had landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Daisy thought Stanley was being very silly. When Stanley was puffing towards the logging station, he saw the model rocket again. This time it had landed right in front of him, and they had to stop. A father and son came towards Stanley and explained about the rocket for a high school competition, and if the boy won, they would go to the mainland to compete with other countries like France, Spain, and the United States. Stanley was amazed and wished the boy luck, but he still longs for the idea of going to space. The father then told him of a video that went viral around the world on YouTube called A Toy Train in Space, made by Ron Fugelseth and his son in 2012, which is still up today. The video had a toy version of Stanley going to space on a weather balloon. Stanley was sad and a little jealous that the toy version of him had gone to space. A few days later, Duck met up with him with some ballast trucks for Stanley to take. He then told Duck about the toy version of himself going to space. Duck understood the longing for travel, but he told Stanley that the best travels are those that could only be dreamt about. Stanley understood Duck's words, but still longed for a trip into space. Then the next day, he was given a plastic space helmet by the group that had taken part in the competition. It turned out that the man he had seen a few days before was also the head of the contest on Sodor, and decided in collaboration with Sir Richard that Stanley would be the mascot for the Sodor team. Stanley was pleased. Ironically, Mattel had released a push-along variant of a Stanley toy based on the popular YouTube video from 2012 around the world, including Sodor. Daisy loves the springtime, a time of year when flowers grow, and it makes all the stations along Thomas's branch line very pretty. However, Daisy hated the smell of fertilizer. She was very opinionated about it all when 2 fell out of Percy's train, and while the other engineers like Toby tried to explain to her why it was important, Daisy was still complaining. She even complained about the level crossing with a bell attached to it for road vehicles to alert the signalman. A lorry driver had done that as she was delivering fertilizer, but when he returned to the crossing he forgot to ring the bell and was trapped in the crossing gate. He was about to talk to the signalman when Daisy came towards the crossing and then crashed into the lorry being smeared with fertilizer. Daisy was taken to the works, and after she came back, she learnt the importance of fertilizer, despite it being a pong. Back in 1994, Wilbur had come to the island of Sodor, and after his performance, Sir Charles Topham Hatt wanted to have an engine like him. However, it was hard to find an engine like Wilbur, as many of his classmates have already been preserved since they've been withdrawn. So the idea of buying one was scrapped until a Heritage Railway had placed one for sale on the mainland earlier in the year, and Sir Richard remembered his father's plan on getting one, and decided to purchase it. The new engine was named Sheffield, and he was to do odd jobs around the railway. One of these jobs was to collect meat vans. The austerity tank engine has a very strong dislike for trucks for some reason, but no one knew why. Meanwhile, Bill and Ben saw him being harmful to the trucks and spoke to the new engine crossly about his disrespect, but Sheffield didn't care what they say and told him that he was to collect some trucks of China clay. Later, the twins biffed and bashed the trucks about to teach Sheffield a lesson about trucks, and indeed he did. The trucks, who were cross with the twins who treated him poorly, took their anger out on Sheffield and pushed him down the bridge at the harbour near the big station, and he crashed into a wall. However, he shouted, "Not again!" He was placed in the out-of-use siding, and Bill and Ben were punished by Sir Richard and the manageress of the clay pits by doing shunting around the harbour, while Donald and Douglas looked after the China clay. Meanwhile, Sheffield was left in the siding, awaiting his turn to be repaired. Sir Richard Topham Hatt had gathered his engines one day to announce that in celebration of the Railway Series' 70th anniversary, a big gathering was to take place with an art exhibition of all the illustrations from the books. Shane, who was built after Wilbur Awdry's passing, was wondering who he was, after Edward had told him later in the day about the announcement since Shane had returned from the mainland. Edward then told him about his first visit and how much his friendship had meant to him and the other engines. On May 12th, the big day came. Edward, Gordon and Henry had taken a special train filled with special guests for the party, and Sir Richard Topham Hatt made a speech. Soon, everyone was being looked on display. Later that night, they were given a very special screening of The Adventure Begins after so many months of waiting. After watching it, all the engines were in total praise, and some had even shed a few tears after seeing what a masterpiece it was. Some merchandise was on sale during the 70th anniversary gala, such as some wooden toys depicting Tomas as how the thin clergyman made for Christopher when he was young, alongside a wooden toy of Tomas as known in 2015. Alongside those two was also a black painted James as shown in the books and the 2015 mini special, a box set and collection book of the Railway series written by the Reverend W. Awdry, and some new toys called minis. Of course, other toys, books and DVDs were sold too during the day. Over on the mainland on May 15th, the British Museum in London had held its anniversary party with some well-known names joining in the celebrations, and on display were some models used for the television series before switching to CGI. A few weeks after the party, everything was back to normal and work was going on as usual on the NWR. A new container yard was opened by Sir Richard, and he bought two new engines named Lincoln and Iris. Lincoln takes the containers to the mainland, and Iris shunts the wagons full of goods to the shed where they were to be loaded into the containers. Some of the engines of the NWR take the containers to the harbour ready for shipment at various harbours, but Sir Richard had decided to have an engine to do the work. Diesel remembered about the engine he had shunted at the old tunnel of Ballyhoo for the old Strategic Steam Reserve project that was now scrapped because the Cold War had ended in 1991. Henry, Gordon and James laughed as the SSR, to them, was a myth. Percy even doubted Diesel too since he was still cross with the dynamite joke. When the news spread, everyone teased Diesel. But Percy thought about how serious Diesel had been, and when he told Sir Richard at Toyrek Station, Sir Richard had confirmed that it was true, and told Percy that because he wasn't owned by the other railway and the army, they could keep him for their own needs. And with that, Percy and Diesel set off to collect him. The old engine was pulled out of the tunnel for the first time in decades. He didn't have a name but was numbered 48102. He was shocked when he found out that the Cold War had been over for 24 years and wondered why he wasn't found. The papers that were signed for 48102 had been lost until they were found the previous week at Topham Manor. Everyone was surprised that Diesel's engine was true, and they apologised, and Percy was happy that Diesel was being true after all. The Walmart exclusive Railway Mischief from 2013 was finally released on Sodor in the mainland. But unlike what the US was given, the DVD was released with 2 more episodes from the 17th season, which were Not Now Charlie and Bill or Ben. This would be released in Australia in June 2016. Later, Rosie's tyre had broken, and she has to go to the works due to the increasing demand for work at the big station and harbour. Sir Richard Topham Hatt was pleased with her work, but decided to replace her with a new engine called Dennis. But she was rewarded to help Mavis at the quarry on Thomas's branch line, as the quarry manager needed a second engine. Rosie was pleased for a change in scenery, but when she arrived at the crossing, she noticed a constable waiting. Rosie had heard about Thomas's trouble with the constable, and Rosie was worried that she might be in trouble. But the constable told her to carry on and told her that the law prohibiting Thomas had been revoked for years. Rosie asked Thomas about it and he told her the story. Dennis came to the railway in 1959 to solve the extra work that the other engines were facing. But he was lazy and took advantage of the engines to do his work, and with that Sir Charles had sent him to the sheds at Crosby. Dennis had stayed in the shed for 55 years, but he was still the same lazy diesel as he was back then. In 2014, Sir Richard Topham had sent Dennis to the works to be checked over. Things had aged since he was left in the shed, and so had to have some repairs done. Sir Richard wanted him to be a spare engine in case Diesel did anything wrong, but Rosie was completed before him, and Sir Richard had used her instead for pilot duties. When Dennis was restored in early 2015, he was used for utility services for the works, such as hauling the breakdown train, permanent way trains, and so on. Now with Rosie away, he was tasked to do pilot duties around the big station. At the sheds, he was to collect Henry's coaches. But when Henry woke up from his dozy nap due to the loudness of Dennis's engine, Dennis had decided to cough and splutter and was to be shunted into the shed by Henry, much to the big engine's anger. Henry, like Gordon, still holds some strong opinions about tender engine shunting. After he shunted Dennis, he took his coaches and puffed to the big station. The other engines, such as Gordon and James, were doing it too, and they were most annoyed as it made them late. The passengers were cross and Sir Richard went to solve the matter. He arrived at the yard and asked what the problem with Dennis was. The driver mentioned his engine trouble, and then Sir Richard had an idea. He asked Dennis to shunt some trucks for the morning goods. This made Dennis worried. If he had turned on his engine, this would get him in trouble for sure. But he knew that lying in front of someone important like Sir Richard was wrong, and so he caved in, and his engine roared to life. Sir Richard was disappointed and told Dennis to take empty trucks to the quarry so that he should think about what he had done. He met up with Daisy, who told him that she was the same as Dennis when she was new to Sodor. She then told him that he worked hard after Percy's accident and was given a second chance. Hard work brings success, according to Daisy, and the next day, Sir Richard sent Dennis to help Rosie while Mavis was sent away to the works to be mended. For the whole day, Dennis worked hard, and Sir Richard was pleased and told Dennis to keep it up. But if he were being lazy again, he would be displeased and told him he could be another diesel generator, although we know that he would never really become one. Meanwhile, in the United States, the third straight-to-DVD Walmart exclusive of 5 episodes from the upcoming 19th series was released, entitled Whale of a Tale and Other Sodor Adventures. Then a couple of weeks later, Target stores across the US released their exclusive DVD of episodes entitled Wild Water Rescue and Other Engine Adventures. Although this DVD contains 1 episode from the upcoming 19th season, and the rest were episodes from the 16th series DVD Big Bang Surprise, which was released with Merry Christmas Thomas on the mainland and Sodor in 2013. Another Christmas DVD was released in the US, which was called Thomas's Christmas Carol, featuring 5 episodes of the 19th series. This will be released on Sodor and the mainland in November 2016, and then Australia in November 2017. During the summer, the Tunnerflin Railway needed some extra pulling power to help run their trains. The Thing Controller had decided to send Sir Handel over there for the first time in 31 years since his last visit. He was once again proven to be popular with visitors, and the railway had set up a special train with his twin Sir Hayden. Back on Sodor, it seems there was life imitating some art when some railway thieves had stolen Oliver and took him to an old worn-out branch line. This was the old Kirk Ronan line, and when Oliver was found and the thieves were arrested, Sir Richard thought that maybe the line could be good enough for tourism once again. It hadn't been open since the days of the old Sodor and Mainland Railway days, and the whole event was almost close to the story Oliver's Find from the 5th season of the television series back in 1998. Over on the mainland, the newest special for 2015 was released called Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, recounting the event that had happened in 1967. The film even had some very special guest stars providing some voices for the new characters, such as the late Sir John Hurt as Sailor John, Academy Award-winning actor Eddie Redmayne as Ryan, and actor, singer, and male model Jamie Campbell-Bower as Skiff. The special was given much publicity through some talk and radio shows on the mainland, and a special premiere party was held at Odeon Leicester Square in London with big names. At the same time, Sir John Hurt was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II at Windsor Castle for his services to acting. A special screening was made for the engines, and they were amazed by the whole production value of it all. Even the music was different, as it was arranged by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra and gave it a very cinematic atmosphere. Later, The Adventure Begins was finally released at Asda stores across the mainland 4 months after the United States had gotten it. It would then see an Australian release in November, and then a Japanese release in December. Usually Japan would get specials a year after its release in the West, but with it being the 70th anniversary, it was released the same year as the rest of the world. Over in Australia, Lost Treasure was released in cinemas, and a few days after that it was released in the US as a digital download. Later, Dennis was away at the works being repaired, and Percy was asked to look after the work while he was away. Gordon and James were teasing Percy for being filthy, although he was just working hard. Percy hated the teasing and told Thomas all about it, and when Thomas told Sir Richard, he had decided to let Percy pull a special train for the Vicar of Wellsworth's Summer Fete, with Bear providing support. Gordon and James were shocked, but Percy knew that they were just jealous. In celebration of the 70th anniversary, a special DVD filled with episodes from the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th season of the television series called First Class Stories was released. The episodes were conducted by the television series' Facebook page voting poll. In September, however, only 4 episodes had aired on Channel 5 on the mainland, the British Isles, and Sodor. The first episode was Who's Geoffrey, and the last was Henry Spots Trouble. None of the other episodes would air on television until 2016 and 17. Meanwhile, the Lost Treasure movie was released on DVD and Blu-ray over the United States, and then in Australia and the mainland and Sodor during the latter part of the month. After being away from the main line for a few months, Pip and Emma's overhaul was complete, and were now back at work pulling the express while Shane still helps around with the coaches and trucks. Meanwhile, Duke was telling the story of Jim to Peter, Sam and Sir Handel, as well as Duck. He told him about the little engine's demise as he was hauling explosives during World War II, and that sparks had ignited from his load and blew the rear of his cab. In the end, Duke told the engines that the Arsdale Miniature Railway can still hear the voice of Jim echoing around the railway. However, Duke was just exaggerating as Duck told the miniature engines about Duke's story, but Mike brushed it off as something silly. But Rex thought different and teased Mike about it. But one night, Bert heard someone saying, "Hello?" but couldn't find the owner of the voice anywhere. He was worried and told the other engines about it the next morning. Mike thought Bert was losing the bolt of his boiler, and Rex told him that he could collect the ballast train that night since he was acting like he was brave. So Mike did, and when he reached the first station, he too heard the mysterious voice. He and his crew found that it was coming towards an old building that was nearby the sheds. He switched on a disused line, and then he stopped, and one of the crew spotted the owner of the voice. A few days later, the small controller and some historians came to the old factory and were amazed by Mike's discovery. Mike apologized to Rex and Bert for his negative attitude. The discovery that Mike had made was none other than Jim, who had come by James from Alsborough. Duke was surprised that Jim was still around, and Jim was pleased to see Duke again, and told him that he was taken from one of the old mines by some men and turned him into a generator for an electricity company, until they were forced out by the landowner, leaving him behind. As the two engines were catching up, Shane rolled past, which made Jim very cross. Duke told him that it was Shane, and that he worked for the Northwestern Railway. However, Jim told Duke to never say that name when he was around. We know, don't we? Meanwhile, the 2014 Christmas DVD, The Christmas Engine, that was released in the US, has been released on Sodor on the mainland, featuring the same episode lineup as what was released in 2014. The DVD would be later released in Australia in November 2016. While 2015 had marked the 70th anniversary of the Railway Series books, it was also the 150th anniversary of the Skarloey Railway's establishment. Sir Handel, who had returned from the Talyllyn after the summer, had told him that the railway had celebrated their 150th too. Skarloey overheard it and was amazed that it had been around for that long. Rhinias then told him about Neil, and Skarloey wondered whatever happened to him. Duncan believed that he was scrapped, but Skarloey hoped there was a chance that Neil may have survived. He then told Derek about him the next morning, and the Diesel had promised to ask Sir Richard about the box tank engine's whereabouts. But Derek had forgotten his name. Although the episode had mentioned Sir Richard knowing about the S&M tank engines in archives, but as we mentioned earlier, records for the S&M had been scarce since they were too casual. However, Sir Richard remembered hearing a story from his father about his grandfather saving Neil and leaving him in a shed at Kirk Ronan. Derek was excited, but Rhinias told him not to get too overexcited. The next day, Derek took Sir Richard and some workmen to the old Kirk Ronan line while it was being restored for service. They came to an old shed that was placed at the harbour and found that it was empty. Poor Derek was very disappointed, and so were the narrow gauge engines. But they had a feeling that the idea of Neil being scrapped was the answer. Skarloey and Rhinias had put on a brave face at the anniversary party. The engines all carried on with the activities for all the visitors. At the end of the day, the Thin Controller made a speech, and so did Skarloey, and he had mentioned Neil. Suddenly, Sir Richard had asked Derek if that was the engine he was looking for, and Derek suddenly remembered, although he had mentioned his name to Skarloey and Rhinias the day before the search. But it was more likely came out of his mouth without knowing since he was overexcited. Sir Richard then told him, Skarloey and everyone else, that Neil had been preserved at the Railway Museum in Vickerstown since 1926. Skarloey was pleased and told everyone that if they ever get to see him, they should wish Neil all the best in his retirement from Skarloey and Rhinias. Later, Emily had been stopped by a cow on the line. Edward came with a farmer to move the cow, and then Gordon passed by thinking it was funny. He still thought it was funny later that night until James spoke up about Gordon being stopped by a cow when it was a calf on the viaduct back in 1952. This made Gordon cross, and he fibbed these stories saying that he whooshed steam at the calf to make it move. But the other engines rolled their eyes. They knew the real story. Next day, Gordon was taking his local train and was stopped by a group of pigs. The farmer tried to move them, but they just kept wandering off. Luckily, Gordon stopped just in time. Gordon was very embarrassed and hoped no other engine would see him. But James did and thought the situation was funny, almost like the calf. Gordon tried to blow steam, but the pigs were used to steam engines and weren't bothered by it all. When the pigs were removed, everyone had heard of Gordon and the pigs and thought it was very funny, including Emily, but Gordon wasn't amused by it all. Mums had passed since Sheffield's accident with the trucks, and he wished he hadn't been so cross with them if he hadn't been so foolish to the trucks back on the mainland. Rumours had been spread across the island that Sheffield may have broken some trucks there. Everyone was surprised and cross. However, neither Diesel nor Edward was buying the whole story because no one seems to bother to ask Sheffield about it. Diesel was delivering some empty trucks to the big station, and the station master had told him that Sir Richard wanted to see him at the out-of-use siding. He was tasked to take Sheffield to the works. Minor repairs were done to him earlier, but he needs to go there in case any other parts need replacement. Diesel had asked him about breaking trucks, and Sheffield had dismissed the idea. He thought they were important regardless of their behaviour in the end. But what was his history with trucks on the mainland? After being repaired, Sheffield was working in the harbour yards near the big station with Pug and Samson. It was Christmas time, and all the engines were busy, but Sheffield never really liked Christmas as he always felt it brought the selfishness out of everyone who just want things. This happened to him when he worked in a colliery on the mainland. But Emily told him that Christmas was about kindness and goodwill and giving people things that come from the heart. But Sheffield didn't believe that until the boy came from the Starlight Children's Foundation in hopes of driving an engine, and Sheffield was chosen to do so by Sir Richard. The boy was named William Benson, a 10-year-old boy who was diagnosed with neurofibromatosis. Sheffield let him on board, but he was doubtful about William and thought he was another needy-greedy person. William was having so much fun, and it began to make Sheffield smile. He then began to wonder what William's condition was all about. And when Sir Richard explained, Sheffield felt very sorry for William, and Sheffield wanted to make this his best Christmas wish ever after thinking what Emily had said to him earlier about kindness and goodwill. He then took William on a long run with the afternoon goods train, which was delivering presents for the less fortunate as far as Vicarstown. William was excited, and he had an amazing day he would never forget, and Sheffield finally understood Emily's meaning of Christmas. Gordon had had a rough year, but he was very glad to take a special train filled with important people who were invited by Sir Richard to the big station in time for the New Year's party. Pip and Emma were to do it, but they were derailed when coming into the station from the yards. As Gordon made his way towards Crobensgate, he had to slow down, as one of the passengers was in labour, and the baby was soon born, and Gordon puffed away as far as Wellsworth so the new parents and the baby can get treated. Gordon was late, but when he told Sir Richard about the whole thing, he smiled. When the year 2016 came in, the father of the baby came towards him was Sir Richard. The father was named Gerald Corris, and in honour of Gordon, he and his wife decided to name the boy Gordon. The father did feel silly for pulling the emergency brake as he was in a state of panic and wanted to pay the fine, but Sir Richard had decided not to let him, as of course a baby being born on the train is an emergency. Despite the rough year, Gordon was pleased to have ended it on a high note. This concludes the year 2012 to 2015, and our next and final video will focus on the next 7 years and the future.